Anglo-Saxon England was a land plagued by internal disputes between royal families and rival kingdoms. Long gone was the age of united and organized Roman rule. England now found itself in the Dark Ages. Rivalries between the greater kingdoms of England ultimately stunted the region's unification and, as a consequence, left it vulnerable to foreign aggression. The most impactful of these aggressions was that of the Viking raiders, primarily from Denmark, which eventually culminated in a full invasion and occupation of northeast England, a region that would come to be known as the Danelaw. This persistent and capable foreign presence on the island allowed the chief surviving kingdom of Wessex to elevate itself as the leading kingdom of a united Anglo-Saxon people. The later defeat and subjugation of the Danelaw by Wessex would then earn it further legitimacy and allow the kingdom to unite England under a single crown. However, this rule was still shaky, as not only did old rivalries once again rise in the absence of a shared enemy, but several ethnic Danes and Norsemen continued to reside within England and retained a loyalty to their culture and government abroad. Thus, while England now stood united, that unity had yet to be fully consolidated. This may not have proved so great an issue had England remained under stable and stern leadership. However, it would for nearly 4 decades fall under the control of King Ethelred the Unready, who presided over additional internal instability and poorly managed a re-emergence of Viking attacks, first appeasing the attackers with ransom money, which only encouraged them, and later targeting Danish civilians within England for massacre, which only enraged the Danes further, and inspired them to retaliate in greater force. Wessex had achieved the heights it had through constant effort and vigilance both internally and externally, but under Ethelred those defenses had been lowered and England was left vulnerable. The Danish king Sven Forkbeard, after coordinating a series of raids against England, proceeded to launch a full-scale invasion, marching through ethnically Danish lands and rallying these civilians to support his war effort. Sven ultimately drove King Ethelred into exile and proclaimed himself King of England, but died a few weeks into his reign. However, his son Canute would go on to secure the throne following a brief return of Ethelred and a continued campaign by his son Edmund Ironside for control of England.
Canute and his father Svein had started off attacking England at the head of a Danish fleet, striking a town and offering battle against the local fjord before sailing away again with plunder in the popular manner that's associated with the Viking Age. By the late 10th century, this had evolved to demanding large ransoms, which would later be called Danegeld in the case of England, and Canute and Svein were no mere war chiefs seeking their fortune, but rather Danish monarchs at the head of war fleets in their own right. After Canute's reign, the Viking Age would never be the same again, as a Dane had been chosen as king of all England, as well as ruling in most of Scandinavia. But where did this all begin? When and why did Scandinavians start to cross the seas in their dragon-headed boats to seek fame and fortune? Well, you can find out more about the start of the Viking Age and why it might actually reach back further than we previously thought in my video on when did the Viking Age begin.
Canute would reign as King of England alone before succeeding his brother as King of his native Denmark, later proceeding to conquer Norway, part of Sweden, and eventually subjugate the Scots, Welsh, and coastal Irish, establishing what came to be known as Canute's Empire, or more commonly as the North Sea Empire. Canute ruled wisely, using diplomacy, statecraft, and force as was necessary to secure his position from rivals both foreign and domestic. He would win over the affection of the people by bringing about wealth and prosperity, and forge close partnerships with some of the most powerful men in Europe to legitimize his rule. Canute drew upon English practices he considered superior to build a fruitful and well-organized economy, which in turn allowed him to fund military projects and public works. His consolidation of power over nearly the whole of Scandinavia allowed him to bring the Viking raids on England to an end, while still making use of the valuable water routes surrounding the British Isles to further enrich his empire. Canute seemed on course to build a titan of a state that would stand alongside the Holy Roman Empire as one of Europe's great powers, but shortly after his death, the empire fractured among multiple claimants, leaving England to briefly return to unstable Anglo-Saxon rule before once again being contested, this time by the Anglo-Saxons, the Norwegians, and the Normans, this later group ultimately emerging victorious under the leadership of William the Conqueror, who ushered in a new age within England that utterly redefined the character and destiny of the country. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate timeline, Canute's empire survived? As we've already stated, Canute demonstrated exceptional capabilities as a leader, but his achievements did not endure following his relatively early death at the mere age of 45, as his succession was complicated by the existence of multiple potential heirs sired by multiple women, not to mention 2 sons from his wife Emma's previous marriage to the former King Ethelred. Canute's heirs themselves dying relatively young as well, with none of his children seeming to have survived beyond the age of 25. Ironically, the sons of the previous king Ethelred had survived, and one of them, Edward the Confessor, would ultimately be the one to seize the throne. We might suppose that in an alternate timeline where Canute had lived longer, he would have taken the opportunity to further consolidate his rule over England and Norway, as well as secure a clean and stable succession to preserve his life's work. Realistically, it may not be that simple. Even if Canute had lived longer, it appears as though he had arranged his empire in such a way that it would have been divided among his sons, rather than passed down entirely to a single successor. This has led some to believe that Canute had no intention of creating an empire that would survive him, but such a theory flies in the face of very evident efforts by Canute to gain legitimacy for his state from the church, and through the establishing of bonds with the Holy Roman Empire, even marrying his daughter to their heir apparent, this daughter, like his other children, also dying before she could achieve prominence. It's likely Canute was simply abiding by the tradition of partible inheritance against his best interests, but hoped that one of his sons would assume full control at some point and allow the empire to endure. Though if that was the case, it was this kind of wishful thinking that ultimately undid all he had worked for. Beyond his family merely having better fortune, Canute's empire required more direct efforts at preservation. The early deaths of Canute, his son Harthacnut, and daughter Gunhilda certainly snuffed out additional opportunities for the empire to rebound from some of its troubles, but their survival alone wouldn't have been sufficient to ensure the continuation of the empire beyond a few generations. Harthacnut, for what little time he did reign, was regarded as a very ineffective leader, and his death is alleged to have been brought on by excessive drinking, something which speaks very poorly of his character. It did not help that many of the men they surrounded themselves with proved to be untrustworthy, weak, or overly ambitious. In all three realms there existed aspiring usurpers and traitors that undermined the empire's unity, and which in England helped facilitate the brief return of Anglo-Saxon rule. Clearly, the North Sea Empire, despite all its potential, was dealt a bad starting hand and never amounted to more than a footnote in history. But this time, things are different. For the sake of this scenario, we're going to suppose that the Empire's early years, rather than be tumultuous and unlucky, are instead tremendously fortunate as well as effectively planned. This means three major changes. 1. Canute, perhaps motivated by his second wife Emma of Normandy, abandons the tradition of partible inheritance and leaves the entirety of his realm to his first son with Emma, Harthacnut, who in this timeline he would take closer care to raise as a more effective leader, rather than leaving him in Denmark under the care of a regent who ultimately used the child heir as a pretense to attempt a seizure of power for himself. This would wipe out one of the key contributors to the succession crisis that followed Canute's passing, improve Harthacnut's leadership skills for when he ultimately did take the throne, and potentially prevent a betrayal by one of Canute's most trusted men, though even if this isn't the case, Canute and his son quelling this rebellion together would, if nothing else, help reaffirm their rule in Denmark. 2. Canute and the key members of his family must live longer to carry out their shared vision for the empire over the course of several decades. Canute himself might reign an additional 10 or even 20 years, while his son could go on to reign for over 30 years, and a similar pattern must follow for his successor. Stable and consistent rule under a single agenda will be key to solidifying this empire into a united entity, rather than leaving it as a series of disjointed realms who occasionally shared a leader. The survival of Gunhilda and the ascension of her husband to the role of Holy Roman Emperor would be quite helpful in boosting the empire's legitimacy as well, potentially gaining the HRE's support in suppressing uprisings within the realm of Denmark and weakening the claims of would-be usurpers unrecognized by the church. 3. More aggressive efforts must be undertaken to assimilate the three realms into a united culture. In our timeline, Canute came to admire the more centralized policies he discovered in England, so much so that he hoped to implement aspects of them elsewhere in the empire. Additionally, Canute was a Christian, which did not sit well with parts of Scandinavia that had yet to convert to Christianity. As such, greater effort will need to be undertaken to spread the faith, which would in turn reinforce the king's legitimacy as a ruler favored by God. More advanced English governing and economic policy should be the standard across the empire, but the distinctly Anglo-Saxon culture of the island would need to be suppressed by that of Denmark. The Anglo-Saxons and Norsemen did share some cultural commonalities, but clearly viewed each other as just foreign enough, something well illustrated by the persistence of the Danelaw within England and English attempts to suppress it. As such, large-scale migration of Danes to both Norway and England should be encouraged to further reinforce the culture of Canute's homeland across these three realms, and settle these lands with a loyal population large enough that Canute need not pander exclusively to Anglo-Saxon or Norwegian demands simply to keep them in line. If those three items could be achieved successfully, the long-term survival of the North Sea Empire is almost assured. The ramifications of a Danish dynasty enduring within England are enormous in and of themselves, not even taking into consideration that this would be just one realm of the second largest empire within Europe at the time. England in the hands of a strong and stable empire means that a Norman conquest is highly unlikely. Even in our timeline, William the Conqueror had the benefit of fighting an English enemy who had already been exhausted by the invasion of the Norwegians. Locked out of England, the Normans wouldn't be overly discouraged, as they had already been exploring new prospects in the Mediterranean, chiefly within southern Italy and later in the Levant during the time of the First Crusade. Norman success in this region had been so significant that a plan was actually devised to establish an East Mediterranean empire at the expense of the Muslims and Byzantines. England, however, diverted resources away from this effort in our timeline, but that's not the case this time around. The Normans still become a powerhouse within the French realm, likely on course to surpass France itself. However, because that power is largely concentrated in far-off land holdings instead of across the Channel, as was the case for Norman England, the French would still manage to re-subjugate Normandy proper, driving the Norman government to relocate to the Mediterranean. The Normans would not go down without a fight, however, and the reintegration of Normandy could be expected to be a costly and drawn-out conflict for the French, though still nowhere near the scale of what eventually became the 100 Years' War in our timeline, when England, because of its relative autonomy but interwoven relationship to Normandy and France, began challenging the French crown for dominance over the mainland. In this alternate timeline, no such war occurs, as England remains a separate entity entirely, and the Normans would have invested a bulk of their energy not in strengthening Normandy and their possessions in France, but their distant empire. The result of this is a slightly faster centralization of France, though not to so dramatic a degree, as Norman efforts would still stall the French, as would the North Sea and Holy Roman Empires, aiming to keep this potential new rival contained. The North Sea Empire itself would have a dynamic relationship with the Normans. Historically, the Danes and Normans had collaborated against the English during Ethelred's rule, and Canute's second wife Emma was herself a Norman noble. Their shared Christian Scandinavian identity would also serve as a solid basis for cooperation against nearby rivals, chiefly France, who the Danes may perceive as a potential threat to their English realm. That being said, given the expansionist tendencies of the Normans, their superior war tactics, and their close proximity, the Danes would alternate between treating them as an ally and rival depending on the circumstances to ensure that the Normans never gained an upper hand over them, which might threaten their English realm. This alliance would become strained as the Norman Empire grew larger, though would return to purely friendly terms upon Normandy's annexation by France and the Norman Empire's relocation to the Mediterranean. The two empires now fixated on France as a key rival and often collaborating to assault it from both the north and south. Over time, the North Sea Empire would expand its hold over the British Isles and Scandinavia, conquering Ireland with relative ease but finding Scotland to be more resilient. Sweden would also hold out for quite a time while minor rebellions flared up in Norway. It's quite possible that one of these first Norwegian rebellions against the Empire would be led by the very capable Harald Hardrada upon his return from his campaigns in Russia and Byzantium, doing so in an attempt to liberate his home from Danish rule. But with the Empire stable in both England and Denmark, it would have no difficulty suppressing this rebellion and bringing Norway back under imperial control. In our timeline, Hardrada's return to Norway was likely predicated on the opportunity created by the death of Harthacnut, which left Denmark and England in a position to be reconquered by Norway, which had a direct claim to the Danish throne. But such would not be the case in this timeline, leaving us with the possibility that Hardrada may not return at all. The Empire would soon hold a near total monopoly on trade within the North and Celtic seas and would begin advancing toward domination of the Baltic, something which would almost certainly bring it into hostility with its traditional allies of Poland and the Holy Roman Empire, leaving the Danes with only the Normans as a reliable ally during this period. Fortunately, the Holy Roman Empire would, as the years carried on, become increasingly decentralized and less of a threat, soon leaving the Danes to contend with only the Hanseatic League or some alternate variant of them. Poland, on the other hand, would be growing in power, leading it to become the Empire's chief rival in the east for a time. However, given the North Sea Empire's concentration on the west and Poland's hefty presence in the east, as well as their historic friendship, a mending of relations could be expected for the sake of prioritizing their already existing domains and allowing them to focus on more immediate enemies, France in the case of the Empire and the Golden Horde in the case of Poland. By 1500, the Empire would have already seen to the establishing of several small port colonies in the New World, having beat Spain to the punch by a few decades upon seeking to revisit potential western land prospects in Vinland as an alternative to expanding into the Baltics. Given the nature of the Empire as a trade-focused economy with an abundance of land in Europe to look after, heavy settlement of the New World likely wouldn't be taken up as it was by England, whose high population but lacking prospects for land expansion made the establishment of settler colonies especially appealing. Regardless, the North Sea Empire would remain one of Europe's wealthiest, most wide-reaching, and most powerful states through its holdings on the continent alone. The USFZ thanks you for watching. Support your Legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z,